The next section we're going to talk about is the Cold War civil rights. We're still in Social Science Resource Guide, Section 1, and we're on page 35 of that resource guide. So during the Cold War, this is the same time frame in American history when we're having Jim Crow laws, and we're also seeing civil rights integration. So these two things are going on in the same time. First thing I want to point out here, while the Cold War led to restrictions on civil liberties of African American activists like Robeson, it also contributed to the enactment of federal civil rights reform. This activist they're talking about is Paul Robeson. He was not afraid to speak out against some of the injustices going on in the United States. And he was very closely monitored by the House Un-American Activities Committee. His passport was revoked. He was subjected to blacklisting for his thoughts and his speaking of his views. So at the same time as doing some of these things that were harmful to African Americans, we also saw some things with African Americans in the United States that got opened up a little bit. So what we had here, if you guys remember, in the Soviet Union, they were much more egalitarian, which means trying to make things equal. So regardless of race, regardless of gender, they were trying to show that everyone was equal. And so this was a little bit easy for them to seize on the Jim Crow problems of the United States. They used this to claim moral superiority. And if you remember, the Soviet Union and the United States, they're constantly trying to fight over who's better. And the Soviet Union had a really good point here. They said that the injustices and the discrimination against African Americans, it was really something that the United States had a problem with. This was a big problem in America. So here's what happens next. Discrimination threatens attempts to establish and maintain positive relations with those newly independent nations. Remember those decolonized nations? So the United States is seeing the backlash to its discrimination. And here what we have here is it's actually becoming a problem, not just domestically, but our foreign policy is suffering because of our domestic problems. So Truman has to do something about this. He can't just let it keep going on. So he issues an executive order. And in that executive order, number 9981, he ended Jim Crow segregation in the military. So he desegregated the military. And so in the Korean War, for the first time, we see integrated units. So of course, this is not going to go well in the South in the United States. So he tries to put this in the frame of national security, which should appeal to conservatives. However, and actually it appealed to everyone, but however, in the South, the idea of desegregation was anathema to their beliefs. It was diametrically opposed to what they believed. So here's where we see the first real rift in the Democratic Party in the 1950s. Up to this point, the South was firmly Democratic. Now, if you guys pay attention to politics, you know that the South is very firmly Republican, very firmly red as opposed to blue. This is the reason why this begins to split. The segregationists in the Democratic Party in the South, they're so angry over this that they split, and they call themselves the Dixiecrats. Well, of course, the Republicans aren't going to just let this opportunity go by, so they incorporate the Dixiecrats into the Republican Party, and that's one of the ways that the Republican Party starts to take a real strong hold in the South. All right, next we're going to talk about Edith Sampson. She is an ambassador for the United States around the world within the State Department here. So this is a calculated decision, right? The United States wants to look like they're inclusive. And so they choose an ambassador who's African American. This cultural diplomacy is something that the United States has been using a lot. We see it in music, we see it in art. They're trying to show the world our culture. And here's an interesting Interesting fact, much of the popular culture that America was exporting to the world was African American culture. The State Department's cultural diplomacy strategy leaned heavily on African American musicians, actors, and athletes. We're talking about Louis Armstrong, for example, and he comes up again later. So Edith Sampson, she is the person chosen to be one of the ambassadors to the UN. Where is this? Here we go. Truman selected Sampson to serve as an alternate delegate to the United Nations. If you remember, Truman has created the U.S. Information Service. This is the first time that propaganda has been made legal in the United States. And so part of the job of the U.S. Information Service was distributing kits of information about the United States to its other diplomats. Information, a film specifically about this woman over here in the picture, Edith Sampson, were included in that kit. And they touted the fact that she was African American. They held on to that and wanted to show that this was an example of how you can succeed in America and still be African American. Sampson also agreed to, she engaged in this as well. She openly acknowledged that racism was a problem in the United States, but she saw herself as a success story. And her message was one that the State Department approved of. She won high praise. Events at home continued to complicate Sampson's attempts to sell this narrative of Americans' racial progress. The facts on the ground were still not supporting African Americans being successful in the United States, especially in the South. Sampson, this ambassador, she stays on as an ambassador for the State Department, but increasingly over time, she's just more and more frustrated. And again, Louis Armstrong's going to show up again as someone that has this frustration as well. So this brings us to the Little Rock incident. Lots of these goodwill ambassadors echoed Edith Sampson's frustrations to civil rights reform. 1954, we have a landmark Supreme Court decision. In this decision, it's called Brown versus the Board of Education. In this decision, they decided that schools needed to be desegregated. Public schools had to be desegregated. This comes to a head in Arkansas, in Little Rock specifically. The governor of Arkansas says, there's no way I'm going to desegregate my schools. He refuses to do it. And what happens is the governor of Arkansas has to the governor brought the National Guard in to stop these African American students from attending the high school. And then these other soldiers had to come in and escort students into that high school. So to have to bring the military in order to let your students go to school, that's a pretty big step. Louis Armstrong, he's in North Dakota at this time, just traveling, touring, and a reporter asks him about this Little Rock incident. And his response here is pretty telling. We saw the "it's getting so bad a color man hasn't got any country." Louis Armstrong was typically a really, really positive, friendly person. So to hear this from Louis Armstrong was really shocking. That kind of sheds some light on what civil rights were like in this environment.